I'm Danny, and this is the AID podcast, otherwise known as Authentically Inspiring with Danny. Welcome to a space where we talk about the good times, but we don't shy away from difficult, taboo topics either. The goal of this podcast is to provide aid and healing in the form of storytelling and share insight from our life experiences. This podcast isn't self-help, nor does it set out to necessarily teach you anything, but rather to share a story and hear your own. Perhaps you learned something along the way. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the AID podcast. I'm your host and resident storyteller, Danny, and today we're diving into part 2 of my coming out story and my first journey of finding my authentic self. Today's episode is called Unmasking the Truth, and there's a blend of courage, authenticity, and a touch of drama in this retelling. To recap, I was forced to hide in the shadows to conform to societal expectations, and, hiding behind a facade of conformity, I struggled with the weight of secrecy and the fear of rejection. As this episode unfolds, you'll hear about my stepping out of the shadows and breaking down the closet door. Despite facing bullying and losing supposed friends along the way, I found solace in discovering my true self and building a supportive community of new friends and chosen family. Before we get started, let's talk potential trigger tags for this series because trauma dumping is real and that's not what we're trying to do here. We want to tell stories so that people may find learnings and solace in them, not more trauma. This series of episodes has potential triggers for depression, suicide, cutting, physical and emotional abuse, and abandonment. And with that, here we go. I started high school like most everyone else. Mixed feelings of excitement to be someone new, and a crippling fear of being judged and picked apart. I know this sounds awful, but I don't remember how many guys I dated in high school. I wouldn't be surprised if I'd had a reputation for being a slut, though I think slut-shaming is a terrible notion because no one would have had any issues with it if I was a dude. Truthfully, I don't think I'd have labeled myself a good person in high school. I tried. I wanted to be. And while sometimes I succeeded, there were also times that I failed and I hurt people. Regardless, I dated any guy I heard had a crush on me. At the time, I enjoyed feeling wanted because it helped me keep up the lie to everyone around me, because I still had that subconscious fear lying in wait. I went through my freshman year fairly uneventful. I dated a few guys, I was an academic, played basketball and ran track, was in the Air Force ROTC, and I had my cliques that I was a part of. I had caught wind of a guy in ROTC that liked me, but I'd never heard of him, and I didn't know him. But I did know of a girl he had dated before, so I did what every high schooler did. I went and asked for her advice. This simple decision changed the entire course of my life. Her name, for the sake of the story, was Diana. I've changed her name, as I will with everyone in the story, out of respect. But Diana was someone I knew vaguely of. We'd gone to the same middle school after all. But she'd dated this boy who was interested in me, and she'd have the details I wanted to know before I pursued this relationship. If you could even call it that. We formed a slight friendship out of this interaction, and slowly began building on that, becoming closer over time. She became the person I went to for advice in many matters, and I was her therapist for her mommy issues. By our second year in high school, we were best friends. We'd hang out all the time, both inside and outside of school, and we'd shared many of the same cast and crew as a friend group and some of the same classes. I finally felt normal. I wasn't popular, per se, but I wasn't bullied and harassed either. I was friends with most everyone, had a home on the basketball team and an ROTC, and my grades were good. I felt like I belonged, and I didn't feel lost anymore. I hadn't thought about my Gabrielle from 6th grade in 3 years, or any girl, for that matter. Before I knew it, midterms had arrived. I was struggling in math, and as someone who got punished for even a single point grade drop, the anxiety was consuming my mind. I was an absolute wreck with fear, and I went to my confidant, Diana, for her insight. She offered to study with me and help me get a grasp on that material. Math was not the subject material that I wound up grasping. We'd been sitting across from one another on her bed, and Diana had this habit of twirling her pencil when she was deep in thought. I needed her help with a math problem, so I reached over and grabbed it, hoping for her attention. This started a game of back and forth pencil grabbing before escalating to a point where she threw my pencil out of her bedroom door and down the long L-shaped hallway of her house. Given I really should have gotten back to studying, I popped up, walked down the hall to get it. I reached down to pick it up, and when I stood back up and turned to head back into the room, there was Diana. She was very close, so much so that I could feel her breath on my face. Before I could say or do anything, she pushed me into the corner of the hallway and kissed me, deeply. When I tell you that my brain broke, I mean it. I completely malfunctioned as a human being. Time and my body were frozen, and it felt like forever that she had me pinned against the wall kissing me. I screamed internally for her to stop, the fear gripping me tightly as I desperately tried to will my body to move, to push her away. All of the feelings I'd been suppressing over the years rushed to the surface, and I was drowning in them, and in Diana. I couldn't breathe, and darkness washed over me as I blacked out and fell to the floor. I don't know how long I was passed out in the corner of this hallway, but when I came to, Diana was in the bathroom. I grabbed my stuff from her room and left without saying a word. My walk home was long. I was deep inside my head, replaying the scenario over and over, trying to figure out what had happened, how it had happened. The fear came rushing back as I panicked that I somehow sent her a signal that I was interested in her like that. What if she told people at school? I'd lose everything I'd spent years creating, that sense of belonging being washed away in an instant. Even worse, what if my sperm donor and stepmom found out? They'd kill me. My feet had carried me to the local park that I found peace in throughout my childhood, and as I sat on a swing, the tears of shame began to fall in earnest. I spent the coming weeks internally combusting, with the guilt, shame, and fear tearing me apart. Every time the phone rang, or I'd get a call into the living room to talk to my stepmom or my sperm donor, my heart would stop. I barely ate and didn't sleep, because that's where Diana was. I couldn't stop dreaming about that moment, and would wake in a cold sweat every night. There was a brief period where I believed I could cut the gay parts out of my body, literally, that I could bleed it out of me somehow. I avoided her like the plague, claiming I needed to study or had practice, or anything to use as an excuse to avoid her. She, however, was completely unaffected, and you'd never known that she'd kiss me at all. None of our friends said anything about it either. I was so desperate to make the thoughts go away, I began to pray. I willingly went to church with my friend down the street, and though I dared not go into a confessional, I would find an empty youth room and weep for forgiveness. My best friend from down the street found me like that one day in the park, and in my despair, I confessed to him what had happened with Diana. I kept crying, anticipating his hateful words of disgust, or the empty sympathy that often ran rampant in the church. Instead, I got his hand on mine, and when I looked at my best friend since age 3, he just said it was okay. I was dumbfounded. Not once in my life had I ever considered anyone would be okay with something like this, especially not my Catholic-raised friend. And to my sheer disbelief, he asked me a question that I might have avoided for the rest of my life. Did you like it? I'd been so racked with fear, and the life of lies I'd built had become so real, that I hadn't even thought about how I used to like girls. I began deconstructing the mask I'd been wearing for so long, and one day shortly after my friend had asked that question, I came to the realization that yes, I did like it when Diana had kissed me. And I wanted her to do it again. It was time for me to talk to Diana. I was terrified to speak to her face to face, so I opted to call her house instead. There were no cell phones at this point, so I had to be cautious that someone else wasn't listening on her landline, or, God forbid, mine. She wasn't available. So I waited and tried again later, to no avail. Over a period of days I called and called with no answer, and only false promises of calling me back. It dawned on me that she was avoiding me. I finally worked up the courage to approach her at school, and oh boy was that awkward as hell. Trying to explain feelings you had, and not knowing how the other person feels is nerve-wracking, let alone doing it with someone who is the same sex. We talked about what had happened, but Diana appeared wholly unbothered by it. When I told her I felt like I wanted to kiss her back, she dismissed it as a joke, saying she was just playing around with me and she didn't want to make it serious or into a girlfriend situation. I admittedly was disappointed. I'd been hoping for a chance to explore this new feeling, and couldn't think of anyone safer than with my best friend, especially because she had kissed me first. But the proverbial knife in my heart was when she said she didn't want to hang out with me as much anymore. Now, bear in mind, this is all from my perspective, and an angsty teenage one to boot. I'm sure she had her reasons for every decision she made, much like I did for mine. But there was no lying about it. In fact, I was done lying about it. I liked her, and her rejection, whatever the reason, hurt me. Then I got angry about it, granted, for the wrong reasons. In my mind, this was all her fault. She started this whole mess. I was perfectly fine in my delusional hetero world. If she hadn't kissed me, I wouldn't be hurting like I was. And the worst part, now I was hyper aware of how gay I was, and I couldn't cram it back into my little box. Nor did I really want to, despite how afraid I still was about people finding out. So I internally labeled myself bisexual, because as wrong as it is, I felt safer that way. I felt like if anyone did find out I was queer, I could use the reasoning of, well, I still date guys, the girl thing is just kind of a phase. Like I said, the comp het fucked me up real bad, and I apologize to any and all bisexuals for taking advantage of your genuine sexuality. I know better now. I stayed in my closet and went back to dating guys around school, and feeling absolutely nothing for any of them. I still wanted Diana though, and she knew that, because not long after she said she wanted to spend less time together, she invited me over to her house. You hear a lot about gay panic in our community, and oh did I have a lot of it when I walked up to her door to knock. She opened it to let me in, and I followed her down the hallway to her room, glaring at the corner that started all of this as I passed. My heart was racing, with both fear of the unknown and excitement to have my best friend back. I didn't want to do or say anything to mess it up. She sat on her bed and motioned for me to join her, so I did, and we sat there for a minute in silence, just looking at one another. Why I felt obligated to apologize to her, I'll never know, but I broke the silence first by sputtering it out, "I'm sorry, Di," before she cut me off by putting her lips to mine yet again. And then I was on my back with her laying over me in her bed, making out with my best friend. My brain exploded, because this was everything I wanted, and the terror that I felt was somehow also exhilarating. It feels good to be bad, they often say, and that was exactly how we both felt, because this began a series of sneaking around and continuing our little kiss fest. It felt so wrong, but also so right, and I couldn't stay away from her. We took our secret opportunities whenever they were there, but we weren't dating. Di was very specific about that. Blinded by the feeling of belonging she gave me, I didn't care. What I knew at the time was that when she kissed me, my world made sense, because I was queer as fuck. As it often goes with these things, I began to grow jealous of the guys she would date or flirt with, and she was definitely a flirtatious person. Much like a bee to every flower, that was Diana. For a time, my jealousy would curb because she'd opt to hang out with me instead of them in many cases, taking me back to her bedroom where the world would melt away for a period of time. She made me feel so special. she'd sing to me my favorite songs, run her fingers through my hair, hold me tightly, and whisper sweet poetry into my ears, soothe me into a blissful sleep. It was during a sleepover at her house that I realized as she was cuddling me that I was in some sort of love with her. I don't even know how it happened. I'd never been in love before, and I didn't know what it felt like. But books described it as either love at first sight or a slow and steady burn. My experience felt like a light switch. Just one day it clicked, and the feeling was overwhelming. I was living in a dream world, but I was on borrowed time. As it turned out, telling the girl that you're having this thing with, but not really dating, that you love her, caused the crash back to reality to hit. As you can imagine, there was a whole bunch of drama around this whole scenario as I suffered my first gay heartbreak, but that's for another episode. I had sad songs played on repeat, trying to find some sort of guidance on making it all make sense. I don't remember how long the fighting lasted between us, but we eventually mended our differences. During my heartbreak era, I returned to feeling lost yet again. Around this time period, I found out my high school had a GSA, which was a gay-straight alliance group. Having now realized and committed to the internal reality that I was part of the rainbow community, I joined the group looking for the same sense of belonging I'd spent my whole life searching for. I think this is the case with most humans, but finding people like me felt like coming home after a long time away. Some of them were just as scared and insecure as I was, and it was a joy to be able to have someone to relate to and share experiences with. Some of them were questioning, and what a relief it must have been to have a safe space to do that. I remember being both jealous and thrilled for these people to be able to have that space and not suffer in silence like I did. I hope that teacher who sponsored that group knows that she saved some of our lives and made such a tremendous impact on us. And of course, some of these kids knew who they were with absolute certainty and didn't waver in it at all. One of those kids was Taylor, a girl younger than me who had all the confidence of knowing exactly who she was in the world. I envied this about her, because despite my newfound openness, I also knew I was still lying to myself. Now, having only shared a few stories back and forth, I didn't know Taylor very well at all. But she had a crush on me that I also knew nothing about until a mutual friend stopped me at my locker one day and told me about it. That friend asked if I'd be interested in Taylor. I was very much intrigued by her, and I did think she was attractive, so I said yes. After that, Taylor approached me, and we began a relationship. She was my first girlfriend, and that came with a whole host of brand new fears. I had never actually dated a girl before, and I had no idea what I was doing. It was very different from what I'd had with Diana, and very, very different from dating guys. There was so much more emotion involved, and the conversations were deeper. The physical touch was electrifying. Taylor was more thoughtful, and wrote me little notes, and got me little thinking of you gifts. It was very natural, despite being new. But there was a big problem with our relationship. She was very much out and proud, and didn't hide who she was in the slightest, which I secretly envied. And I was very much still in a closet. This problem caused a rift in our relationship. She didn't want to hide me, and wanted to go out on dates in public, outside of school. I very much wanted to stay hidden within the confines of school. And yes, I know that makes zero sense, but that's just how my brain worked at the time. Being too far out of the safety of the closet meant that everything would change. How my friends thought of me, how my teachers would treat me, how I would even move through the world. Would all my female friends worry I secretly liked them romantically? Would they assume that I liked all girls, instead of crushing on one in much the same way they crushed on one or two boys, and not all of them? Would the girls in the locker room shrink away from me as if I had a disease, consumed by their own homophobia that I would objectify them and treat them the same way boys would? Contrary to a belief that is widely speculated, most of us in the same-sex community do not unabashedly flirt with and want to date or sleep with every person we see. I've often wondered why people have this correlation that being gay means you're sexually attracted to every person of the sex you're attracted to. It's weird. Don't get me wrong, there are people like that of both the hetero and homo varieties, but I genuinely was looking for a deeper personal connection with a singular person. I don't see all women and picture dating them or begin drooling over them, but rather if a particular lady caught my eye, I wanted to know more. To get to know her, her brain, and her heart. The feminine form is a gorgeous thing to me, but there absolutely has to be a connection for me first. But how could people possibly know that about me without knowing I was gay? How could straight people possibly understand how a gay person approaches dating if they weren't gay, or knew a gay person themselves? And that's why I just explained it from my perspective. I always encourage people to open their minds and learn different perspectives of the people of the world, so that we may all learn and grow. It's one of the many ways we will. Anyway, back to Taylor. She was my dirty little secret, and much like the song, she was the only one that needed to know. Hindsight is 20/20, and looking back on that time, I completely understand how much I hurt her by keeping her a secret. I experienced being someone else's dirty little secret after I had fully come out years after my relationship with Taylor ended, and it fucking sucked. Yes, there was a high of sneaking around and leaving people speculating, but never quite knowing. A weird sense of elitism that you feel because you know something that they'd never figure out. But that wears off after a time, and what's left is an emptiness, and that void begins to fill with distrust, hurt, and shame. You begin to wonder, why doesn't this person you care so much for want to shout from the rooftops about how happy you both are? In some cases, they go so far as to date someone else as a cover, a beard as it's called, to make sure your real relationship stays hidden far away from the world. We all have our reasons, and I'm not here to judge, especially having been on both sides of that coin in my lifetime. But that life lesson taught me personally how Taylor felt all those years ago. Like I said before, I wasn't the best person when I was younger. She told me how much it was hurting her. Such a healthy relationship dynamic for a teenager, honestly. But I ignored how she felt, in favor of my own selfish preservation. We began to fight over it, and the time we spent together was tainted by the secrecy, rather than enhanced by it. Ultimately, I lashed out about it and ended the relationship. I was told later that I broke her heart. It wasn't Taylor who told me I'd broken her heart, though. It was Kaya. And this is where I got my first real-life lesson in lesbian drama. Kaya was another girl in the GSA, and was friends with Taylor. She had apparently been crushing on Taylor since before Taylor and I had even dated, and I'd just become Kaya's public enemy number 1. When I tell you this woman hated me, I sincerely mean it, and she did not hesitate in letting me know what a horrible person I was for breaking Taylor's heart. I didn't need her reminder, though. I felt awful about it. And I still do sometimes. That didn't matter to Kaya, though. Her temper was as fiery as her bright red hair. Every chance she got to throw me a glare or words to slice at me, she took full advantage of it. I literally didn't even know who this girl was, but she was making my life a living hell, trying to set me on figurative fire for breaking up with Taylor. Honestly, this part of my life was a blur, and I don't recall how Kaya and I wound up on friendly terms down the road. But at one point, I got to explain to her why I did what I did, why I was so afraid of being out. She understood, and eventually forgave me enough that we could be friendly towards one another. Being bullied was new to me, so when I told my childhood best friend about what was going on, he invited me to a place called Out Youth with him. Turns out, he had also been exploring his own sexuality, so he'd been secretly going there with his own friends. Having my best friend to figure this shit out together made a world of difference for me, and we began a routine of going to this program under the guise of going to a church program instead. This was before the big boom where everything was on the internet, so there were limited ways our religious parents could ever find out, nor did they question it since we'd grown up going to church together. It was the perfect cover, and the most wonderful place. They had books for every possible questioning topic your little queer brain could come up with. They had a therapist there too, and when I tell you this program saved my life, I truly mean it. When I was younger, all us little rainbow kids wanted was a place to exist safely and be who we were without any judgment or fear. We even got gay prom, because none of us could go to prom with our same-sex partners and actually get to enjoy it. This program taught me so much about myself, and I learned so much from the other kids' perspectives and their experiences too. I also learned a lot from Lena, who I met in this program. She was another queer kid who knew who she was and was confident about it. I had a type when I was younger, I guess. Lena made me uncomfortable, in a good way. She pushed me outside of my comfort zones and helped me become more confident in myself. We spent weeks flirting back and forth, and I knew she liked me, and she knew I liked her, but she refused to ask me out. I was too scared to ask her because I'd never actually done it before, and she knew that, but kept hounding me anyways. Finally, I mustered up my courage to outright ask her out, and she just laughed and laughed before saying okay. This relationship with Lena was so easy and carefree. I felt zero pressure because the times we saw each other the most was at Out Youth, since she went to a different high school, but we occasionally hung out outside of Out Youth. She didn't do drama, which I also didn't want to do, yet somehow it kept finding me. But I liked that about her. Our relationship was innocently pure, and I truly loved the time I spent with her, laughing and simultaneously talking about deeply philosophical topics. Going to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. She helped me get strong enough to come out of the closet, at least a little bit. With Lena's help, and having gotten sick of carrying the burden of pretending to be someone that I was rapidly learning I was not, I came out openly bisexual at school. I was still afraid of calling myself a lesbian, but I was also back in rebellion with myself once more. I knew the risk of someone getting that information to my sperm donor and my stepmom, and honestly, they probably suspected I was gay, but never said anything for fear of disrupting my fragile mental state. Even back then, the statistics for queer kids and suicide were exponentially high, and I had previously been an at-risk youth already. I was so exhausted from the lying and pretending, and the relief I felt with a half-lie was something I was grateful for. Naturally, rumors began flying, and before the end of the week, most of the school that knew who I was now knew I was queer. While I waited for the other shoe to drop, Lena broke it off with me, though for the life of me, I cannot remember why. We were still friends and talked to one another, and sometimes do even as adults. Whatever the reason we split, she was the only relationship I had that didn't end in a chaotic disaster, and I've always appreciated her for that. I now entered an era of open dating possibilities that had previously been inaccessible to me, without extreme secret keeping anyways. At 16, I had now been romantically involved with 3 very different girls, and was beginning to formulate an idea of my type. I was also forming an idea of what typical teenagers begin to wonder about a bit into puberty, and the most embarrassing thought occurred to me. I didn't have a clue what to do with girls. There were no books for me like there were for girls and boys of the straight varieties. I read them anyways, for hope of finding some sort of useful information in them for the girl perspective of the experience, but they were wholly unhelpful. Seeing as how I was entirely single at the time, my only thought as to why I was panicked about this is because my friends began talking about some of their experiences, and I was left in the dark. What they talked about didn't really apply to me, and it's not like we could talk about this in GSA or health class. I was also afraid to talk to my therapist at Out Youth about it. In the spirit of being completely authentic and honest about this experience, while embarrassing to admit, I will tell you how I first learned about sex with women. Fanfiction and chat rooms. Yes, I grew up in the time of AIM chat rooms. I lied about my age on the internet, though told the truth of my new lesbianism experience. and by some good fortune and huge strokes of sheer luck, I found myself in a chat room with supposed local area lesbians. Y'all, the age of the early internet is fucking terrifying. I wound up agreeing to physically meeting these women at the local mall food court to talk about this subject. They were all expecting a 19-year-old to sit down at the table, and when I plopped my 16-year-old ass into a chair, the silence was deafening. A flood of explanation fell from my mouth about why I lied, and again, through good grace and dumb luck, I happened upon some of the kindest and compassionate ladies I'd ever met. In all of the thousands of ways this entire thing could have gone sideways, it simply didn't. I remember they answered my questions in a wholesome and age-appropriate way, and directed me to specific and more accurate books I could read to learn more on the subject, given fanfiction is a hit-or-miss fantasy world. They gave me the information and resources so I could be safe and smart when I eventually decided the time was right. Fortunately, the digital age enables a vast wealth of knowledge for kids today that simply didn't exist when I was younger. The trick, though, is knowing what information is correct. If you don't know where to look, you can find some resources and insight on my Patreon page and in our private Discord community. With every day that passed, I began to feel like I was coming out of the shadows, like I was breathing for the first time after being underwater for years. The more I began to understand about homosexuality, and specifically the history of lesbianism and the movements of the community, the more I began to feel at peace. I still had the same fears circling my brain, but I also felt like I was putting myself together bit by bit. I was building my castle out of every word I read and began to become more confident in myself. I'm not sure if that confidence is what caused one of my deep-seated fears to manifest or not. But one day after basketball practice, a few of the girls from one of the other teams at our school cornered me in a hallway and launched into a homophobic tirade of insults. They also started launching punches. Fortunately, I came away with only a busted lip, easy to explain away the questions that arose. Something interesting happened to me after this pivotal moment. Instead of succumbing to my fears as I had in the past, I got pissed and refused to be bullied back into my prison. It was one thing to choose to put myself there, but something else entirely to be forced back into it unwillingly. I ultimately made a choice to tear off my mask in earnest, and shattered my glass closet to pieces, kicking the door down with an unbridled rage. Left among the debris was 17-year-old me, embracing being a lesbian for the first time in my life. I felt naked without my closet as a shield, and extremely vulnerable. But I also felt a tinge of real freedom for the first time in what seemed to be my entire life up to that point, just in time for my final year of school. While I had accepted myself as a lesbian, I was still a long way away from being proud of it. Speaking of pride, remember how I mentioned earlier in the story that I had been in the Air Force JROTC program? It was something I spent most of my free time doing. For 3.5 of the 4 years I went to high school, this program was the largest part of it. I'd been a flight commander, operations commander, logistics officer, JAG officer, rifle team commander, color guard commander, saber team commander, PT commander. Just about everything I could have been. It was my life. I worked my way up to cadet captain rank, and had a badge plate that was quite heavy, with I believe 7 rows of badges and a medal. Every single one I earned with grit and determination. Some of them with leaves, indicating I had earned them several times over. We had 3 tenets that I still hold core to my values today. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. And an unofficial one that, as I've gotten older, means more and more to me now every day. Attitude is everything. I tell you all of this to paint the picture of how invested into this program I was, how ingrained into my very being. My goal was to enlist and become a military police officer. Something American high schools do is something called a letterman jacket, where you earn a letter in a program at school, typically sports, but also academics, performing arts, or other activities. You can also earn patches for that jacket. I lettered in basketball, but 3 times over in ROTC. At the time, my colonel told me I was the only person to have ever done it, and I looked forward to following tradition and writing my name on the graduating ROTC class mural in the classroom. This program was my school family. I found brothers and sisters there, both ones who I looked up to and who looked up to me. Within my very small worldview, it was everything to me, which is why I grieved when it was taken from me and when I was forced out of that program. Every school has a mean girl or two, and apparently I'd created the pattern of being a heartbreaker while I was figuring out who I was, which sounds stupid as I talk about it as an adult. But there was a girl who was now dating one of the boys I had dated early on in high school, and she held a grudge against me for hurting him when I broke it off. I don't think she was even in high school when I dated this boy, for goodness sake, but here we were. This girl made a huge deal out of my behavior outside of ROTC. My gay behavior, mind you. To our leaders, and my Letterman jacket was confiscated for conduct unbecoming of an officer. I was livid and heartbroken. They took something I had rightfully earned, something I'd put my soul into, and took it from me simply for having the audacity to be outwardly gay. Turns out the don't ask, don't tell policy was in effect in high school too. I had to write a lengthy letter apologizing for my conduct, swearing to never breach the code again before they returned my jacket to me. Once they did, I reckoned with the fact that I couldn't be myself with this so-called family, and when I asked my then leaders about it, was told to best keep those behaviors under discretion and in private. When I pressed the subject, they effectively told me to either fall in line or leave. Once we were able to choose courses for the second semester, I left. I found new family in theater at the guidance of my high school sweetheart, Kaya, whom I'd started dating earlier my senior year. Yes, that same Kaya, who had previously hated me for breaking up with someone she'd cared for. I don't recall how it happened, or what the timeline was due to how long ago it was, but I remember developing feelings for her and telling her about them one day, and they'd been mutual. We'd started dating, and this began my first out relationship as a lesbian, where the only people we hid it from were our parents, for good reason. Before long, I was head over heels in love with this girl, and she with me. We'd exchanged love notes, and I wrote her poetry to slip into her locker. Every time I touched her, felt like my skin was on fire from the thrill of it. I couldn't believe how lucky I was to be with this girl. We had a fairy tale romance in almost every sense. Forbidden love, secrets, overcoming trials and tribulations, only for love to win out in the end. For a time, anyways. I typically hate cliffhangers, but I want these episodes to be digestible, so we're going to cut it off here because it's a little long. Join me next time for the dramatic ending of this 3-part story, coming at the end of the month. Catch you next time. And remember, it may not be fine right now, but it will be. Stay safe out there, folks, and I'll see you next time for AID.